Well, as the Sixers get ready to end their preseason basketball tonight, we got treated to some unexpected news here earlier this morning. Coming to you live from the Xfinity Mobile Arena and presented as always by Rothman Orthopedics. I am Derek, joined by Kyle on an emergency pod as Harris and Blitzer Sports and Entertainment, the group that owns the Sixers, has hired Bob Myers to be the president of sports. Bob Myers, obviously the longtime general manager of the Golden State Warriors. Before that was an agent, a basketball agent. Most recently has been at ESPN as an analyst, leaving that job to be the president of sports for Harris and Blitzer Sports and Entertainment. How you doing, Kyle?
I'm doing well. I hate that this is what the Sixers have done to me. But the first thing I thought when I saw this news and that Bob Myers is being brought on board was, oh, they're going to use this to bury that they're not actually playing Joel Embiid in this final preseason game, right? That this is a big enough story that they'll somehow sweep it under the rug. Like, oh yeah, nothing to see here. Actually, he's not on schedule, but I'm just messing around, obviously. But well, it is funny, big news.
Because there's going to be a lot of reactions from Sixers fans, and look, a fan base that went through the whole Jerry Colangelo era. I think a lot of people are going to connect that dots, and we'll get into whether or not that's fair and whether or not that's what's going on here. For you to go to they just need a temporary distraction over bad injury news. We have been hurt so badly.
Yeah. So where do you want to start here, Derek?
I mean, I guess I'm sure we've both reached out and talked to people. Overall, what's our general impression of what his role is going to be, what's been reported, how we expect this to impact the Sixers, and probably the short to medium term job status of the current P-Bop?
Yeah, so I think how we'll look at it is it's at least a little bit of reflection of the tough spot the Sixers are in rather than what Bob Myers is probably coming here to do, right? Like I do believe that the things that we have heard and been told about, hey, this is going to be a multi-sport, global type of role, right? Like I think all those things are true, right? I think when Bob Myers stepped out of the Warriors job and took the job at ESPN, I believe that if he was going to come back into the executive world, that it was going to be some kind of, all-encompassing, pretty powerful role, right? Rather than, hey, I'm just responsible for one team, right? And I just make decisions for one team. And, compared to a lot of other ownership groups, the HBSE arrangement, we'll call it, is unique where he can have his hands on several different sports and several different franchises. And while they technically are not the Commanders group, right? I believe that's a Josh Harris kind of side project, we'll call it.
It's a good point because I saw some people speculating because Schefter in his reporting did specifically say HBSE / the Commanders. The Commanders are not owned outright by HBSE. They are HBSE owns a portion of it, but that is mostly Josh Harris is the principal owner of that. There are other owners like Magic Johnson, famously, who have nothing to do with HBSE. So that is not directly managed by HBSE, and that's why they're not included under the HBSE umbrella.
Yes, but Bob has already been involved with a bunch of the operational, let's say, decisions and hirings that they made with the Commanders when Josh took over. I believe there's some reporting as well that at last year's Combine, Bob was with Josh Harris and the Commanders' kind of power structure during some of these interviews. And some Commanders fans raised some red flags, right? Like, why is this guy who is an NBA guy there? I think Bob Myers would go on to explain, like, I'm here to be a sounding board and ask questions and just be a resource. And, whatever common experiences that apply from the NBA to NFL stuff, I want to pass those along. And I want people to, kind of share that experience, right? And so, look, I think overarching, you would say this is a smart guy who won a bunch of titles with a team that was pretty revolutionary in that sport, and that's great, right? But I think because Daryl Morey is under such scrutiny coming into this year and coming off of this stretch of years he's been in charge, and because the bulk of Bob's experience is in the NBA as both an agent and then later as an assistant GM and GM, a lot of people will jump right to, if this year doesn't go well, what is Bob Myers going to do, and how involved will Bob Myers be with the Sixers? And I'm not saying that he's coming here to chop Daryl Morey's head off, but I think that's the natural conclusion a lot of people will take.
Yeah. No, I think two things. First of all, I think Josh has always wanted a guy by his side who can speak both business and sports. We've seen some examples of that in the past. Not all of them have been qualified to do so, but they have tried to do so nonetheless. So I think from that perspective, this makes sense, especially as Josh Harris's sports empire continues to grow and grow and grow. And I do think Bob Myers has a lot of interest in sports outside of just basketball. You know, he, like you said, he spent 25 years involved in the game of basketball, first as an agent, first 12 or so years as an agent, and then since 2011 as first the assistant general manager. I think he was only assistant GM for like a year, not even a year. And then since then, the general manager of the Golden State Warriors. But I think this being a role where he can do more than just basketball is certainly why he is here. And I also tend to think that he would be here even if Daryl Morey was on the safest ground possible. Like, I think he truly, and it's just based off of initial conversations and also previous reporting on Myers, I think this would be something that they would have interest in, even if Daryl Morey his job was perfectly safe.
Yeah.
I think where it gets interesting is, Schefter reported that the power structure is Morey will continue to report directly to Josh Harris. That's great. But the thing with Josh is always, it's not necessarily what the official org tree looks like. It's who has Josh Harris's ear and who does Josh Harris trust. And if something goes wrong, will Myers be involved? Well, of course, he was hired to be, president of sports for the entire conglomerate. But I don't think what I'm trying to say is I don't expect in 9 months, if this season goes sideways, I don't expect Bob Myers, president of basketball operations for the Sixers. I would be surprised if that happens.
Yeah. Now, I will say something we found out this summer, or this past summer, I should say, Derek, was Bob Myers was credentialed at Summer League through the 76ers, which we found out and raised an eyebrow because Bob Myers was employed by ESPN, who broadcasts all the games from Summer League, right? So presumably you didn't need to go through an NBA organization to get a credential. And Bob Myers, with an extensive history as an NBA executive, not having a hard time getting a credential, right? And so that was something that we filed away at the time and said, hey, keep an eye on this, right? Because there are a lot of people who get Summer League credentials through teams, right? Extended family members, different friends of the ownership group, right? It's not exactly a strenuous credential process.
Right. I mean, they let us in.
Yeah, exactly. They let a bunch of us in, for that matter. The whole squad was out there. But it was noteworthy because it meant that Josh Harris and the powers that be felt it important enough to include Bob Myers under their umbrella for that event, right? And so we filed that away at the time. And so I think, like, to your point, Derek, where we've seen this go haywire or cause some confusion in the past with power structures and let's call it a too many cooks in the kitchen situation, is when Elton Brand is the face of the Sixers front office, but there were a lot of other people jostling for power and throwing their weight around, trying to get in Josh's ear. Previous to that, when Sam Hinkie was still ostensibly in charge and you had Jerry Colangelo come in and he's overseeing everything. And then it's, hey, Sam could continue with the role with this organization. And Sam obviously knew what that meant at the time and said, thank you, but no thank you, and posted the very infamous resignation letter that all of us ended up reading later, right? So I think if there was a concern on the Sixers side, it would be, you don't want this to turn into a messy, no one knows who's reporting to who, no one knows who's really in charge, and having it devolve into one of the front office setups of the past that led them down a negative path, right? As long as there is a clear chain of command, as long as they follow this sort of org chart as they're laying it out. I think Bob Myers is a really smart guy. I think also on top of that, Bob is a connected person, right? So even if it's Bob adding people to the organization near Morey, around Morey, connecting him with people that maybe he doesn't have the best relationships with, he is a good guy to have in this umbrella for a multitude of reasons, right? And I also think, for whatever it's worth, him and Daryl have a pretty good relationship as far as I understand, right? Like they competed at the highest levels in the Western Conference playoffs when Daryl was running the Rockets. The Rockets were basically the only team that did not run scared of those Warriors during that period. And I think because of that and because of their shared time in the league, both of those guys have mutual respect for one another. But one of those guys happens to now be in a more powerful role within this broader organization, and we'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, it is like I do think a key differentiator here is that I don't think Bob is gunning for Daryl's job, and I might be completely wrong on this. When Jerry came in, I remember there was a lot of cope of like, oh, maybe he is just coming in here to offer his experience and work together, and I immediately pushed back on that. I didn't believe that for a second. I do believe here that Bob wants more than just to be the GM of the Sixers. So if he's not gunning for his job, that leaves him open to offer a more candid and honest and truthful evaluation of Morey and all the other GMs than someone like Jerry Colangelo, who may have had a little bit of a vested interest in getting him fired. So I think it's fundamentally a better position to be in than the previous versions of this. I don't think the risk is quite the same. I'm not saying that, like, I think people, because I think there are some people who want to act like Bob isn't going to have influence over the Sixers. And I think that's a little bit naive that the guy who spent 25 years involved in the game of in this NBA basketball specifically isn't going to have Josh's ear on basketball decisions. But I do think from initial impressions, it doesn't seem like the structure is as chaotic as it previously. Like if HBSE only owned one franchise and it was the Sixers, and Bob Myers' one role was with the Sixers, it'd be like, what the heck is going on here? But I do think this is fundamentally different. And I do think like there's a lot of people necessarily, I think there's a lot of people in the chat talking about his pedigree and his resume with the Warriors. I up and down. Like I think you got to remember Steph was before him. Clay was before him, I believe too. Draymond was under his watch.
Clay was the draft where he was the assistant GM to Larry Riley, I believe. And then, so his first draft, because originally when he was hired in, I believe it was 2011, the plan was he was going to...
It was like a multi-year apprenticeship, I think. Yeah.
He was supposed to be an apprentice for a few years under Riley. It ends up within 11 months, he gets promoted to GM. And so he oversaw the Draymond draft. Now, obviously, Draymond becoming Draymond hinged on some pretty big luck, right? Like, I think they basically stumbled into the lineup of death and all the other stuff. And the thing that I like about Myers that is reflected in how he has talked about the Draymond thing is that, yes, they made that decision and they made Draymond who he is, right? But he also had the humility to say in interviews years after the fact, like, look, we drafted Festus Ezeli ahead of Draymond Green, right?
Yeah.
If we knew Draymond Green was going to be Draymond Green, there is no chance we would have waited until what was it, pick 35 or pick whatever pick it was in that draft. We would not have waited that long to take him. And obviously it's easier to say that when you've won titles and all the successes happen. You can be humble about, hey, we could have made a massive mistake by waiting this long. But I think when you hear a quote like that and someone is able to take one of the big feathers in their cap and say, hey, look, like even that decision shows where we could have erred, where we could have gone wrong, and how kind of fragile all this is. Those are the types of people and the type of mentality you want to see overseeing sports organizations, right? That I know that the Warriors are kind of famously associated with that light years quote from Joe Lacob, right? But I like that Bob Myers is both a fairly sharp executive, but someone who knows that it can cut both ways very easily and very quickly.
Yeah. Again, some hits. Draymond, obviously a huge hit. Some misses. Zealy, like you mentioned, Wiseman, both drafting him and holding on to him for too long. Even the Kuminga pick, like that was a loaded draft, and he's kind of out of the rotation at times, but also getting paid like $25 million. So, some good, some bad. I don't think was a bad GM for sure, but I think people want to give him all the credit for that Warriors dynasty. Obviously, Steph is a driving force in that, and he was beforehand. But like I agree with you, and especially in a shared power structure, being humble and being willing to give credit and acknowledge luck outside of yourself is a big deal. And again, with maybe some of the people that Harris had tapped in the past on these shared power structures, that wasn't their personality type. So I think that is a good thing to call out. But we will see. Ultimately, the near-term future is still determined by Joel Embiid. And if Joel Embiid doesn't work out, I kind of wasn't expecting Daryl to be here in 5 years anyway. So I'm not necessarily sure. Like, I think one of my big takeaways is hopefully if you do ever have to have another GM search. And again, I don't really think Bob is going to try to run Daryl out or take over his job. I don't think that's his angle here. And if you do have a GM search, hopefully Bob helps you do that a little more thoroughly than they have in the past. And that's sort of like my coping optimism.
Yeah. I would put a bow on it like this, Derek. It's always good to have as many smart people as possible within an organization. But I would say if you look at sports teams, it's not always about having all the best talent you can, right? Sometimes it matters about fit, culture, and a bunch of other things. And by the way, we are getting other Sixers breaking news that maybe we can just discuss right now, Derek.
Jeez,
according to Chris Haynes, Joel Embiid has been cleared to make his preseason debut tonight against the Minnesota Timberwolves. So, Conspiracy Corner Kyle was wrong at the start of the pod. I was just joking. But big news. Arguably bigger news than the Bob Myers thing. Maybe it's not even arguably.
I mean, certainly for my short-term emotional health, it is.
I am very excited to see Joel Embiid play basketball tonight. That is awesome.
Agreed. All right. I am not sure that I have too much to add at this point. It is a pretty developing story here, and I'm sure we'll get more information at the time. Like I said, I think him being in this role is just different and makes me a little less nervous. But I do think he is a smart guy who can speak both languages, business and sports, that Josh has always valued. And of the versions of this that Josh has hired, I think he is more qualified than pretty much any of them. So I'm going to go with cautiously optimistic on this.
Derek, we're checking boxes. We're clearing thresholds. We're ramping up. We're doing it all here, baby. Let's get ready for tonight. And obviously best wishes to Bob Myers as he takes on a very important role in Philadelphia.
I just hope he understands. I just hope he understands how chaotic this franchise can be. Maybe he doesn't quite have that perspective from the outside.
He will find out soon enough.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us here in this. And of course, remember, we do have a post-game. Devon and Rich will be in the studio following tonight's preseason finale. So be sure to check that out. And we will talk to you all soon.
We all silly like the mayor.